Violence rarely announces itself. More often it settles in quietly into habits and routines, into the background of everyday life. As this conversation unfolded in part 1, the focus slowly shifted from what violence does to people to how it shapes the spaces they move through. At a certain point, it stopped being only about experience or memory or identity. It began to point somewhere else. Welcome to In Substantia. I'm Gabor Farkas. My guest is Guillaume Soto-Mayor.
Can we understand our economic systems without understanding violence?
That question opens the second part of this conversation and sits at the center of Guillaume's book, The Economies of Violence.
What we've proven in that book is that the hidden variable is violence.
From here on, the lens widens, away from individual lives alone, and towards the system that organizes power, value, and harm. That is where we begin.
Economists tend to treat violence as distortion. You seem to suggest it might be foundational. How do you see that dynamic operating? In what ways does violence create or sustain value within a system?
Gabor, there are many aspects around this which we must address. And I would like here, if you may, for me to mention a few. The first one is that when we talk to economists about the centrality of violence within our societies, they tend first to put under the carpet, I would say, all of the revenues generated by all forms of illegal or illicit economies. So, the ways that many OECD countries have done that carpet move to put things under the rug is by basically integrating within the GDP calculation the revenues from the illegal or illicit markets that are grossly calculated. So that basically doesn't exist anymore. It is just basically integrated within the GDP. So that creates also a form of artificialization of the GDP, right? Because you have a significant part, sometimes up to 10, 15, 20%, that comes from uncharted territory. But that's just one part of violence and its correlation to capitalism, right? First, we need to have, I would say, a historical comprehension of the topic. Is how was it built? Where do empires and powers come from? Not only within Western realms, but of course China, the Ottoman Empire, etc., etc. And what we see here is that the lure for economic power, for technological invention and capitalism as a whole system managing the two has been, a critical dimension, conquering new land, new species, on shaping as well our societies as they are in political dominations as they have been. So that's one, I would say, critical dimension. The second one is trying to understand how do competition work? How do innovation work? How do market efficiency work, right? And what we have seen is that violence here is a fundamental variable, omnipotent, indeed structuring. And this is where the work of economist and criminologist Clotilde Champérache has been extremely strong in the first chapter of this book, is that the classical economic and neoclassic economic vision that have built a vision that is pacified, of the market, where exchanges are harmonious and where violence is absent, is not only idealistic, but is utterly wrong. Again, first, because it is built around a strict separation between legal and illegal economy, which doesn't happen in the real world. You have many, legal companies that own illegal assets or that benefit from illegally obtained assets within their own value chain. For instance, mineral, wood, even I would say land or sand, illegally obtained, earlier within the production chain that is detrimental for their competitiveness and their product, okay? But also because later you also have a lot of illegal actors owning different critical parts of our economic systems. They own sometimes banks, they own companies, and they own entire sectors sometimes of our economies. The most obvious ones here are waste management, but you have actually many others, and you have many investigations from Europol and others that shows that organized crime around the world have, not only within, again, the construction business, not only within the waste management business, but in many legal companies, legal entities, important shares, right? So we need to understand here that violence has been and continue being, again, a structural component of our societies. If you want, I can give you some numbers, but the informal economy represents 70% of total employment and above one third of the GDP of emerging economies. It is not marginal anomaly, it is absolutely central. We estimate that money laundering represent, trillion of dollars a year, trillion. To give you again a critical example, we have a systemic infiltration of our financial system by violence. And here you have, again, give an example within a Swiss realm. A 2008 inquiry showed that the 'Ndrangheta, one of the most powerful Italian mafia, detained over 45 billion euros within Zurich banks, as much as the Mexican cartels having laundered over $350 billion within HSBC banks in North America. So here we need to understand again that this is not anecdotal. It is really a foundation that can be traced back to slavery, that can be traced back to colonialism, of course, but also in more contemporary terms, in the ways that structurally today you are being competitive on critical markets in terms of labor exploitation, for instance, in terms of critical supply chains for different aspects of our economy, and in the way you engage as well within different industries, within your supposed beneficiaries or consumers. And there, of course, we can talk about some of the pharmaceutical with the OxyContin scandals, some of the alcohol, tobacco, and more dangerous products that also, are critically using, different tools, not only their control of science, of media, or lobbying, to diminish publicly the importance of violence within, their own market and within their own product. So you have, extremely large, and different aspects that demonstrate from facts that violence is not, again, anecdotal, but absolutely central within our economic system.
Yes. And in the case of HSBC, we can go back to the opium wars as well. I mean, I think I seem to remember that is how they were set up to finance opium wars.
They absolutely. And that's a very good example. Thank you very much for mentioning it. And indeed, HSBC was created to launder the money from the opium trades in Hong Kong. And if you look again at the ways that many, not just HSBC, many of the large insurance company were built. They were built to insure some of the slave trades. They were built to securitize as well some of the, So you have, again, it is a foundation to our economic domination, to economic power, to financial systems, and the high frequency trading. Let's go back to that example within the financial system has also been detrimental to accelerate a number of illicit and illegal operation, and very likely also have been built around that. Let's talk about financial system again in complement to what you just said. First, let's talk about fiscal paradise. Where were built, fiscal paradise, and for which reason? And let's talk about, again, also special economic zones around the world. Thousands, over 5,000. A great book by Queen Slobodian describing modern capitalism that I very strongly encourage to read, The Capitalism of the Apocalypse. And within this book, Queen Slobodian, who was a professor at Boston University, describes the over 5,000 special economic zone existing beyond any kind of traditional sovereignty prism. So again, this is why violence also is interesting. It shakes our understanding of sovereignty and the traditional relationship to the territory. And why is that? Because on this over 5,000 places around the world that were built to facilitate, again, some of the illicit trade and to launder money and to create additional competitiveness for companies, the idea was to create space where large multinationals, in correlation with some of the state and their elite, wouldn't have to respect any kind of labor law, environmental law, or fiscal obligations towards social contracts around this world. Again, more than 5,000 territories around the world are concerned with this. It is, again, not anecdotal. It is a critical part of our economic and financial system. And among those, the most famous one being Dubai, of course, and the United Arab Emirates in critical dimension, not only Dubai, but also Abu Dhabi and others. And within those territories, what do happen? Well, they are the critical interplay where illicit products, counterfeit goods, illicit minerals, illicit, again, sometimes even illicit wood or sand, etc., become legalized and get an official stamp to have a certificate of origin in a way and a recognized origin from which the next part of the economic system will have a form of legalized product that they will be able to use and process in in recognized terms. And so all of these areas around the world, and it also applies, of course, to fiscal paradises, including Switzerland and Liechtenstein and many others, were designed in that regard. They were designed to welcome money from different parts of the world, from, again, people that wanted to escape the social contracts, that didn't want to contribute to, the ways are just like to the society, while still benefiting from many of their advantages. And when you think about the Bahamas, to give that example, one of the critical persons that was detrimental for creating this fiscal paradise and a special economic zone was Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky, the two most important boss of the American Cosa Nostra, after their loss of another special economic zone, Cuba, that they tried to regain by financing the operation, of the Bay, the Bay of the Pigs, and the American Cosa Nostra, again, and that's another look to see how violence has history and actors of violence too. As they failed to reconquer Cuba, which was their land, it was a narco state entirely. It was a mafia state. Created another place to launder their money and used the Bahamas for that, and Miami. And so where does now the Mexican cartels launder a huge part of their money and many other critical actors of violence? Florida, 70 years later. All of that is critically related, from which was the most important, very likely, very likely what was the determinant factors of Bush election against Al Gore in 2000. It was a little Florida county around which there are very strong suspicion that the Italian-American mafia helped the Bush family switched the tail, and in that regard also avoided Florida to become Democrat. And that if that had been the case, Al Gore would have been elected against George Bush. Everything is interconnected.
A few hundred votes made the difference, and I never understood why Al Gore just refused to ask for a recount. Anyway, the book brings together very different realities. Warlords, informal markets, digital coercion. What thread connects them for you?
What connects them is their capacity to detain and use violence, and to be as such recognized as the main detainer of violence, either at local, regional, or international levels. What, Gabor, I think we must understand here is that they become as well critical elements of sovereignty. They become organizations and structures that do access a form of sovereignty power. They have a control of territories. They have a control of the destiny of the people within that territory, from their capacity to use, extract, or guarantee access or control the access to a critical resource, such as water, or to control critical resources or critical competitiveness at regional, international levels for other states. And so to use again here violence as a leverage, let's give an example. We can actually think here that when mafias invested into the waste trafficking, they understood that they would become critical components, of the competitiveness of many industries around the world. Why? Because they avoid the extra cost of incinerating, but also of, for many states and localities, of, taking the visual cost, the social cost, the political cost of having very large waste management systems incorporated within, metropolitan areas, let's say. And so they became, an official delegation of a critical component of our economic system. And so as such, they became indispensable partner, right? And they gain what Joseph Nye, also a great of influence that I forgot earlier, they became actors that detain smart power because they can use their capacity to, handle or not handle waste as a critical leverage when it comes to political power. They can say, for instance, in the city, through different unofficial case, sometimes it is through unions that they control or small companies. Okay, we stop handling the waste. We leave it in the street, and they can engage into a confrontation in that regard, and very often they end up winning it. Or they can also use that case. They can use that leverage to say to critical industrial or political powers, well, we also would like to obtain access to critical public markets, access to a form of judiciary impunity, because again, waste, just that critical market is so important for them when it comes to, let's say, to Germany for the management of industrial chemical waste, right? If you cannot handle that at national or regional or local level, as it is right now the case, well, how would you do if from one day to another the mafia said, no, stop, we leave it all in Germany? What would you do? And so this is where we must understand that this actor become also key components of basically the ways our societies are run.
Well, we have to take a step back. I think we have to look at the definition of violence, or your definition of violence. There's a form, the bureaucratic form, denial of access, legal neglect, that are often the ones that we least recognize, yet they are the ones that endure the longest. So how do you personally understand the word violence? Where do you draw the line between physical harm, structural inequality, and the quieter forms of coercion we tend to overlook?
No, thank you for that question. I think that I tend to distinguish, and I know it's not perfect, of course, between micro and more macro forms of violence. So I tend to think about violence as a behavior, right? As, again, a form of identity. And so as a way that people at micro level, again, engage with other, it is a form of domination, of exploitation, but also of power that is being used again at physical, psychological, or more social levels. Again, it's describing a way humans and communities interact with each other. Okay, so that's the micro level, and the more macro, what I called the structures of violence, describe again the ways our societies are being built or have been on violence as either, again, a key component to explain power, to explain motivations behind the decision making of the most powerful people within, again, our societies at local, regional, international level. and the way to explain again why they came to power and how they exert it. So here again, the economies of violence. So again, understanding violence as we mentioned already as a critical explanation of why is or are certain economic actors more powerful than others. Okay, so violence as a behavior and violence as an interpersonal relationship dimension at micro level, violence as a structure, and so as such as a key component of domination, of power between the key actors composing our societies.
So you reminded us that the book is a collective book with many contributors. So working with several contributors means encountering other lenses. Which perspective most challenged or expanded your own?
I learned from every single of these chapters, honestly, and of the different dimensions. The Professor Louise Shelley, made an incredible work, incredible investigation and chapter on the centrality of violence in several labor-intensive economical sectors within the U.S., both from the prison systems, but also the agricultural, the fish industries, and different and others. So showing that there are violence against women and men within different, again, labor intensive industries, not only in prostitution, not only in classical slavery, as we might think, but that a lot of the service industry, a lot of the agricultural industries, the fishing industries, or the prison and the different companies that benefit from the prison production. It's an extremely important component of the American, private prison system that is, an investment as well for many, because it is where you, as a company, can produce shoes, computers, or furnitures for a very cheap price. And so you invest into private prisons to access this cheap labor. And so an apple or a carrot or maize can be competitive against others because you will have used, for instance, undocumented migrants that you would have paid 1/3 of your competitor, that will have paid social taxes and paid better salaries to his workers. And as such, the benefits, the economies that you will get from having underpaid people that you have exploited, and so use violence in order to exploit them in many ways. You will have stolen their passports. You will have used private militias to frighten them. You will have used a number of pressures against them to keep them quiet. This violence capacity as an economic actor will make you more competitive than others, right? And that applies as well to a lot of the agro-food industry across Europe and in different parts of the world. Another chapter from which I learned a lot was the influence of violent actors within the management of water in large cities across Southeast Asia. The chapter from Dr. Nazia Hussain, which I thought was extremely rich, describing the mechanisms around which what she describes as water mafias take over gradually. Not only the distribution, but also much more and more the production of water, and becomes indispensable political and social actors thanks to that power, because again they are now a critical component of whether people can survive, entire families can survive or not through this critical investment. So she shows that not only they get, of course, a power in the sense of economic benefits, but they also get the a huge amount of political and social power thanks to it.
Oh, well, thank you for the segue, because I wanted to explore some of the stories that are in the book. And the first one that I thought we could talk about is the chapter on small-scale water providers in Manila, which shows how coercion can exist within legal markets. What does that reveal about how development or regulations sometimes reproduce the very harms they aim to fix?
A critical part of the answer here is the way we engage with governance, and of course, a critical tool of violence at every level is corruption and is the embezzlement of public resources. And why am I saying this in response to your question? Because where a lot of the development, strategies and programs have, in my views and the views of most researchers, dramatically failed in the last decades, is to address governance issues, to address issues and that applies as well to any part of the world, north and south. When you look at the diversion of European funds across Europe, when you look at the diversion of international aid across Africa, it is a problem that applies again to every single public market system of every single international aid transfer or money transfer system around the world, irrespective of being a development or developed country. Okay, when you look at Africa right now, we consider that Africa might be a indebted continent. In what sense? In the sense that there are more illicit financial flows that goes outside of the continent than money coming in from international investment or international aid.
Yes, $80 billion a year.
Exactly. It means that structurally, and this is where international aid either directly contributed to that or insufficiently addressed this issue, there are more money, again, flying out than coming in. And it means that the elites that have, the power in terms of, not only embezzling, but also using that money, that do hold access to critical resources, are being tolerated and supported, given political, geopolitical, legal, financial power, technical power, to remain as such, because they are stable partners, because they are important, again, grantors of access to certain, again, resources, to certain regions to control military presence. So they are extremely important interlocutors for the international community and for the states behind them, because these local elites are extremely important interlocutors, because they will be the one, for instance, granting access to a number of public resources and to a number of critical contracts. They will be the one granting as well access to certain territories, which is very important for military presence. And so in that regard, the international community has been inclined, I would say, to have a very, what we say, a very legal approach of democracies, or institutions, in the sense that they would consider that following the check of a number of, I would say, very insufficient elements, such as just the tenure of election, such as the nomination of a government, and that would be composed of different components of the society. The country would be considered safe enough for investment, good enough for economic and financial partnerships, and of course for military or political one. And that has been not only very subjective, but also very often contrary to popular interests and to sovereign, will of the people in the countries in question, and has been done in a ways that would tolerate or insufficiently look at, again, the embezzlement of the money in question, of the systemic corruption being in place, and the fact that that also creates systemic violence. Why? Because, of course, you create systemic discontent and frustrations following the incapacity of the state to apply and to put in place the different promises that he will have made in terms of enhancement of those public services, and facing, of course, growing demand due to demographic growth, to enhance people living conditions, access to public representation. Well, if you finance and support an elite that gets control of the key parts of the state, and that keep that control because, of course, they get a lot of financial advantage due to it, and so is, of course, more inclined to hold on power, and so you create frustration at every single part of the ladder. Frustration on the ground for the incapacity of the state to fulfill its promises, but you also create dissatisfaction in the sense that you won't have a capacity for the people to have their voices heard and represented within governments and within political structures. And in that regard, of course, you have then actors of violence taking advantage of it and saying, well, we will be the main providers of social services. We will be the main providers of justice, of protection, of, again, also identity. And taking advantage also, so not of being powerful alternatives to the states, but also sometimes taking power themselves, and with very strong popular support, which keeps on surprising Western elites to see, populist leaders rising in different parts of the world. But this is the real the real origin of it. It's a profound discontent against local elites and their international backers, notably within those in development those development realms. And of course, we mustn't, and I wouldn't make that mistake. Consider that the entire development industry is responsible unequivocally and monolithically to that issues. There are, of course, incredible people, incredible institutions and programs that exist throughout the so-called development world. But I would say that overall, if you look at the glass half full or half empty, I would say that overall the problem remains and is perhaps the most fundamental one.
There's this chapter on warlords and governance, and I think that was your contribution. You talk about warlords and violent entrepreneurs. You describe how force can turn into governance. How does that transformation happen, and what does it tell us about legitimacy itself?
Thank you for that question. Yes, the what we are seeing is that warlord gets their legitimacy at two levels: locally and internationally, right? There is a constant threat around the world, being in Afghanistan, in the DRC, or in other parts of the that they will get power from their capacity to hold on a territory. That again questions the notion of sovereignty, right? So they become the basic sovereign of a part, of XYZ state, due to their capacity to physically use, again, violence or the threat of violence, not only against the people, but against the state and other armed groups eventually present on the territory. And, on that portion of land, control access, control extraction, control redistribution of the resources, and rule and impose their rule, their moral order on the population living on the territory. And the main, what we have found is that around the world, again, the main capacity that they have to exert, to implement this violence and to hold on this territory is connected to the fact that they have direct access to critical resources, being mineral resources, being again all form of extractive resources, oil, gas, etc. That gives them also very often an international legitimacy. An extraordinary example of that, Gabor, is South Sudan, or the war happening in Sudan right now. In South Sudan, the two main, Salva Kiir and Riek Machar, the president and the vice president, constantly fighting for the last 15 years, have been considered as rightful interlocutors of the international community and gained legitimacy because of it, thanks to the capacity that they had to guarantee a form of continuity, of security, of the extraction and the distribution and the transportation of oil and some critical minerals, right? So they gain power and legitimacy as such as they got clients and international backers at state levels. Those buyers being some of the main oil companies from different parts of the world, Chinese, French, American, with their state and then geopolitical tension also rising and being, played around that lines. Same for what is happening right now in Sudan. In Sudan, international backers, United Arab Emirates, Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Russia and others are involved within this conflict for different reasons. But one of the primary ones, and the current massacres happening not only in Sudan, and that has been happening for the last 20 years, around the fact that MIT and as Rapid Special Forces, which is one of the two main, part of that conflict, have the primary access to a lot of the gold mines across, Sudan, and of a little bit of the oil production, but most of the oil is situated in South Sudan. So the key, component of those warlords' capacity to pay their soldiers to become legitimate rulers in the fact that they will be able to protect their constituents and then to be also recognized as rightful international partners and as such receive, again, international backing, weapons, of course, but also diplomatic support. And the United Arab Emirates have conducted, for instance, vast lobbying campaigns within international media and across different international institutions to support and to back the Rapid Special Forces mercenaries, right? They have even connected them with different other mercenary groups, Colombians and others, to support them. They have given them weapons and support because, again, the United Arab Emirates are very, very interested and needed to get access to cheap quality gold that the Rapid Special Forces provide them in tons every single year. So that's the where the interplay comes. Again, local and international, support and backing.
For me, historically, the Sudanese conflict used to be an inter-religious conflict. And it's strange how that has evolved into something completely different. And the country was divided because of those religious tensions. But I might be I might be oversimplifying that aspect. But that's how it resonated with me. This religious tension between North and South that ended up causing the country to split up.
If you look at really the motivation behind the splitting, right? If you look at the ways that also the religious card has been manipulated and I would say, overly branded by certain international actors in order to justify their support to South Sudanese warlords or to Omar al-Bashir in the north at the time, the dictator that was overruled in Sudan. If you look at the profound motivation, and again, this is where we were talking before about the structures of violence at macro level, is like what do justify the use of violence or the indirect support to violent actors, right? It was the access to an economic good, being oil or gold, primarily. You have, again, other elements, for instance, for Russia to get an access to the Red Sea with Port Sudan. You have, again, many different other aspects that play into that mix, right? However, the primary, justification and I would say incentive was that and remains so.
When you look at the different cases that are in the book, what patterns do you notice? What makes violence appear ordinary, even necessary within economic systems?
I would say, again, where violence becomes the most central within our economic system, this is where also we can see that it is a structure. It is because, again, it is a critical component of the competitiveness, of many value chain, of many products. It is one of the main reasons that they become competitive. I'm going to give you one example. We could give many. The fashion industry. The West, especially Occidental countries, have been detrimental in trying to build a more sustainable, locally produced fashion industry after the complete fall of their own textile production in the 70s, 80s, and 90s following the globalization. And so in the last 20 years, I would say many countries around the globe have been trying to reignite a local textile production and through the made in Switzerland, made in France, etc. Okay, and this was starting to grow, percentage after percentage to build through also very powerful campaigning and so not only around the pricing but also to images, which is a very powerful component of our economic systems. It was starting to gain ground. In the last 3 years, most of this effort have been destroyed by the arrival of two critical actors, Temu and Shein. And what Shein managed to do in Temu is, destroy the market with one clear slogan, which was, we are making fashion accessible. How are they making now fashion accessible? Through price. How are they so competitive? 10 times sometime, cheaper than others, thanks to the use of violence. And this is where also, I think that some analysts and people looking at these issues are failing to see, the importance of violence. This is why we were speaking about a bit earlier, right? Because it is through the fact that you have labor exploitation within the production of that chain, but also at the distribution level. I would give you the example of Prato in Tuscany, which is the main hub for textile coming from Asia, and then the distribution across Europe. Mm-hmm. Prato is controlled by the triads, by the Chinese mafia, and by the Italian mafia, almost entirely. So also very cheap, cost, because you pay less taxes, because you have many exploitation of labor in that part. So violence at the production level, violence at the distribution level, and then we could even say at the commercialization one, through the use of extremely labor exploitative companies such as Amazon to distribute the clothes at extremely fast paces. And we know, for instance, that Amazon is using techniques to lower their cost that I consider being violent. Why? Because they voluntarily, and this is, the economies of violence, it is a choice, it is a voluntary choice to exploit others in order to gain benefits for yourself. And this is what to use violence, again, physical, mental, legal, against another group of people, against another person, to gain personal benefit. This is what Amazon is doing by, for instance, forbidding their employees to go to the bathroom during working hours, and forcing them to work at extremely fast paces in terrible conditions, and at very, very low salaries. It is exactly the point. So violence throughout the value chain that made fast fashion, this is the called, Temu, Shein, much more competitive than others, and destroying, the efforts that had been made to build a more sustainable fashion industry, or making it much more harder. So competitiveness, very important thing. And the other aspect of that for me shows how systemic this is having prominent industries that knowingly harm their consumers being defended and promoted at, again, institutional political level, thanks to also tools of violence such as institutional corruption, financial corruption, and so on. We could give here the water scandal, the Nestlé scandal in France. Swiss company in France owning many of the water production, the water sources, that knowingly was selling water for decades or years, that had, some harmful components, some harmful minerals, and even feces in some of them, because it wasn't filtered properly and it wasn't considered a natural water anymore. We can speak about the diesel gate. The diesel gate is amazing in that regard, of course, because you had really large car companies selling cars that they knew were harmful for their consumers. And
they manipulated the tests. Yes.
Exactly. And had then also political institutional support in that regard. Airbags, the airbags coming from these very famous Japanese companies that also were knowingly harmful and killed again. And this has consequences on people's not only health, but killing people, at the end. So, and that shows to me this two spectrum, competitiveness and key businesses, central businesses out of our current economic systems that do have, again, violence, economies of violence as the heart of their system. And of course, we need to talk, and we will, I know, talk about certain algorithm within some of the key.
Yes. It's
of
coming
our
up next.
system.
I just wanted quickly to react to what you said about Shein and Temu, which I'm not going to defend in any shape or form. But just to add that Amazon is just part of that terrible fast fashion industry. And because, well, they have been dominating the market, European market and American market, but so is Zalando and other companies who've established themselves over the past year. And I mean, you could also look at what's going on with Shein and Temu. And as a reaction against Amazon and Zalando's dominance on these markets and the over exploitation of Chinese manufacturers, because they're selling more or less exactly the same products, sometimes under the very same brands, and or sometimes it's just drop shipping. Or but what happens is that the manufacturers in China are just rebelling. They're not making more money with Shine or Temu, but they have a direct access through Shine and Temu. They have a direct access to European markets. That's another way of looking at the current issue.
And you can look about Zara as well, and
Yes.
other very important companies having part of their production in Uyghur camps in China. So many other examples in that regard. Absolutely.
Let's turn to this part of the book that I'm really interested in. The book also explores the digital world as an amplifier of violence. And the digital world seems to concentrate many of these dynamics. Algorithms now mediate what we see, believe, and feel, turning attention itself into a resource. We often hear that algorithms amplify. Con, your perspective, how do social networks and algorithmic systems relate to violence? Do they create new forms of it, reflect existing ones, or simply reveal what was already there?
The 3-in-1. They make violent dynamics more, more profound. They increase, for instance, let's give a concrete example: financial speculation on agricultural goods, for instance, in that they transform into derivative products that are exchanged by algorithm to the millisecond, which are totally disconnected from the real prices of production and the human needs, which creates a permanent volatility, which enrich speculative parts of our financial systems and ruins some of the producers, especially within our in developing countries, but also within more developed ones. In the sense also that you have what we call algorithmic prisons, right? That will considerably reduce the possibilities of people to engage with one another at micro level in a more nuanced, peaceful way. So it increases the Manichaeism, it increases the us against them kind of narratives. And what I would add, Gabor, if I would say, is that, as you rightfully mentioned, you have some new forms of violences that were traded. For instance, the capacity of certain cyber mercenaries to generate, antagonism, to generate antagonization via certain bots, via certain algorithm, is a new traded commodity used by companies, used by some multinational companies, used by different states to, win elections or to assert their economic power, their economic domination by ruining an opponent. So this has been, in a way, again, a new traded community of violence. The last point that I would like to mention is that within the different actors of violence, the organizations that have put violence as a key element of their own power in terms of their capacity to exploit, their capacity to violently extract, to violently dominate. Again, another kind of human beings, different part of the world at their service. You have among those certain people within the Silicon Valley. That's what we call, some of the tech lords. And within some of their visions of the states, within some of their projections, you have a utopic project around which the algorithm becomes the central part of governance. The algorithmic regulation, it doesn't only limit the capacity of nuisance of state institutions, of public regulators, of companies, but it really has an aim to place individuals, underlings, people that are the masses, not they're not considered, part of the elite, part of the people that have in their minds a rightful place among the rulers. So they are very, adamant that we must understand that some of the tech lords, the tech magnates, are very comfortable with the idea of autocracies because they believe in absolute free market, but absolute free market in which they are the one. They are the one determining the rules. They are the one determining the vision of the human being. And one of the key component of that, again, is algorithm. One of the key tool that they maintain in order that they will use in order to maintain their economic power, their economic domination, and their political one also is, again, algorithm. It is a really old technocratic utopia of a politic without politicians. And in this model, conflicts they are surviving, but they're not even the necessary consequences. They are just here, and they are detached from it, again, because they can manipulate the minds, they can manipulate the masses in a way that will always protect them from these political conflicts. And if you look at YouTube algorithm, if you look at even some of the Google or Facebook, and the profit also that they generate, and the economic power that they have, it counts in the hundreds of billions or trillions. What we found, and many investigations proved it, is that their algorithm was voluntarily designed in order to create dissension, in order to create antagonism between people. That had direct effect in many conflicts around this world, in Myanmar, in Ethiopia. You have many examples, but also, within our societies during Brexit, during Trump election, during most of the elections around this world right now. And so that really shows that this is not, again, something anecdotal, but this is, again, something very structural.
Many of these systems were designed with the idea of connection and openness. What happens, in your view, when good intentions meet the economic incentives of digital capitalism? How does meaning, truth, and trust survive inside that tension?
They survive. They are, I think, here between us. I don't believe that there is, a full alternative truth, or a fully manipulated or fully, disingenuous relationship or truth like predominant. I believe that they are, competitive narrative. I believe that they are competitive truth. Sometime, again, disconnected from many realities, but I believe that they continue existing in different social realms within people's, again, within the different social circles that compose all life. One of them being, of course, the family, the love relationships, the friendships, the work relationships. Within the different social circles, different kind of realities can be maintained, and I believe that they are. And so what we can see is also that this kind of they are the places where people encounter, the places where people discuss long term. In let's say, for instance, the citizens conventions that happen in France, on different questions. We found out that people that were in appearance fully polarized, unable to talk, unable to create a common basis of different truths, not a unilateral one, but at least a common understanding, and sufficiently, to create projections. Well, we found out that actually, through this citizen convention, for instance, on related to death, so to death in the what sense, related to euthanasia, assisted death. Well, even on very sensitive topics such as this one, or on climate issues and the necessary action from the French state, this citizen convention arrived at consensus level that were close to 97, 98%. So yes, it is possible. And many initiatives around this world have shown that when people spend time with one another, when there are still places where they can encounter, when they actually talk and take time to go beyond preconceived ideas of one another, that also are being, of course, forced upon them within those algorithms, within those digital spaces. Well, we find that actually there is a lot of positive and common truth that can emerge. So I do believe that they still exist.
I am a mediator, and what I've noticed is that when you get people around the table, you can get them to a consensus. You can get them to agree. What happens next is the problem is when they go back to their groups under peer pressure, they will not follow through with what they've agreed in the room. And the dissension reappears because the belonging to the group is more important than what they have achieved. So the problem is that also it's difficult to give visibility to collaboration. You can show dissension. That's what we're shown in the news media and on many platforms. Dissension is spectacular. Collaboration isn't.
And so money, because it means traffic, and as traffic becomes money, dissension becomes money. And
So I've been exploring a thought experiment that I call the collaboration token. It's a way of imagining infrastructures that could reward cooperation instead of outrage. From your perspective, what would it take for a system like that, one that makes empathy and reciprocity visible, to exist in the real world?
I believe that first tokens are right now in many ways part of the real world. And you are saying, it's still, exploratory in many ways. But so for our audience, a token is, a commonly agreed value, a commonly shared good, or, for instance, collaborative schemes, as you just explained, Gabor. So basically, you can give a value commonly agreed to collaboration. The more you collaborate, the more the token will increase value. This is very, very simply explained, but this is the gist. And so, yes, I do believe that exists. I do believe that this is where many of the blockchain, technologies can have a profound effect in our communities and within the encouragement of, and the valorization, the visibilization, as you mentioned it, of collaborative schemes, and also beyond antagonization, beyond differentiation. I do believe that there is a massive aspiration of people, to have, collectiveness, utopia that are, but also very real in their lives, credible solution, tangible path that can, be more peaceful, be more human, dignified, human centered, and mutually respectful, and I would say positive and optimistic in that regard. And so I think there is a crave for that around the world. We've seen that countless times. And one of the critical elements here, and this is pretty much what we are trying to achieve with Egregore, and this is where, the connection, between, my analysis of violent dynamics and Egregore lies, is that I believe that the one of the critical components to fight against violence is to make hope more credible, is to make collaboration, as you said, more valued and more visible, is to make this existing solution more resilient and more, again, accessible. Because in themselves, they incarnate in people's life something tangible that they can touch, that they can connect with, and around which you, me, and others, we can actually project a bit like a more peaceful future together. And so I believe that one of the critical issue here is that collectively we need to support better these existing solutions, these people working for the general interest on the ground, on the field, within NGOs, startups, research teams. And we need to make the solutions that they are currently developing at our service more available.
Both your work and the collaboration token idea examine moral economies, systems that quantify or circulate ethical behavior. Is there room for moral architecture inside digital capitalism?
Yes, I believe so. in one of the key elements around which we need then to think about, and one of the main thinker around that issue is Indy Johar from the Dark Matter Labs and others, is rethinking what we consider value to be. We think about value as a transactional value within our capitalistic systems, whereas actually value is a much more thorough concept. And what I believe is that we need to collectively, then you spoke about visualization, we need to collectively visualize what collaboration, what protection of the environment, what care or ethic actually brings and represent in terms of individual and collective value. And so it means, for instance, that these behaviors need to be valorized within our educative systems, within our general culture, media, etc., and the people that incarnate them also. When we think about the opposite behaviors, we have 20 names coming to our mind. Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, Elon Musk, etc., etc. When I think about people that incarnate the values we just talked about, collaboration, solidarity, it's very difficult for you, me, and others to identify commonly around this, either collective or individual figures, right? And so we miss that component. And then the other side is then also to create capitalistic systems around which that are sustainable, that show, that demonstrate that ethic, collaboration, and other also create value, can represent something. One thing around that is we are seeing that with Egregore in different areas right now, is that there is a incredible valorization of caring of the teams of people that are acting at the service of others, caring about their well-being, caring about their ethical practices and the way they engage with others in the same field, is a critical component of their capacity to grow and to dedicate their time and energy to what they are actually best at, but also to collaborate with others in the smartest way in order to become more accessible to new publics, to new geographic areas. So ethic and collaboration in that sense around the well-being of the teams, around the capacity to open and to create meaningful alliances becomes an essential component of, again, your capacity to expand and so to create additional value.
So the question of responsibility, who designs, who decides, and what we choose to value leads naturally into what you just mentioned, the ethical and philosophical terrain of your work. Do you think violence is an unavoidable part of how societies organize themselves? Or could we still learn to structure life around completely different principles?
If you look at homicide statistics for the last decades, we see that it's quite constant, and it is predominantly young male that perpetrates it. The numbers around, again, homicide are relatively constant. And so what it leads many people to think is that violence is inevitable. It is part of the human nature. It's part of our society, deep, rooted functioning. However, what we have seen is that the ways our society normalize or not, or on the other hand, make culturally, morally much more unacceptable or not certain kind of violence, have a very strong effect then, of course, on the law, but also on the social acceptance of violence. And so has a very strong effect on, beating your children in the streets, for instance, or on, gender violence in our societies. We can see that those evolve, and based on the moral and educational and cultural acceptation, we see that in reality it does have an effect on the evolution of violent behavior. So I do believe it is possible collectively to work on it and to evolve as a society. And I do believe that every single human being have violence and peace within them. I believe that then, it is really our social construction, our norms, our education that will then shape the ways we express those So yeah, this is my answer.
Yes, violence seems less about instinct than about what societies reward or tolerate. Which philosophical or ethical traditions help you make sense of these systems of harm? And are there ideas we've forgotten that you'd like to see revived?
I mean, there are many philosophies around which we can take, inspiration from. I believe I take inspiration from different kind of spiritualities. Of course, I think there are inspiration to be taken in Islam, in Christianity, of course, as well, very, I would say ancient knowledge. So it's a very tough question.
The problem is that we are not descendants of pacifists. We are descendants of people who survived through violence, who exerted violence on others, sometimes to conquer territories, sometimes to defend themselves. So pacific tradition might have existed, but most people who lived by that were killed. So that line of humanity seems didn't survive.
So I believe that there are in many spiritualities and in many, not only many religion and philosophies, ways that try to teach us not only to reflect on our own selves, but also to collectively overcome the possible violent nature of the human being. And I think a lot of the spiritualities, philosophies have been built around that idea. Is also not only the idea, again, the concept of the social contract, which we've talked about many times, but also the notion of social peace. And there is a thinker that I would like to mention among others, and again I could have mentioned some of the Arabic thinker of the 12th and 13th century, again Hinduism and Buddhism, but also some part of some of the more recent Catholic research. But then there is a Tyson Yunkaporta, which is an Australian thinker, and he wrote a book called Sand Talk and how indigenous thinking can save the world. And I believe that he offers like essential perspectives to rethink violence and governance. And he develops what he calls the right story and the wrong story, where basically violence is described as a narrative break. That the fact that violence is born when dominant stories tend to scrap, to really erase other stories, to impose linearity rather than a web. And they are collective process of narration where everybody contributes, where everybody, even on a contradictory level, it's called a yarning method of governance through stories that allow people to really lower the violence within themselves and transform it into like a relational learning and bonds. I believe that a lot of those knowledge exists and survived and is present in many parts of the world, in many local or national governance systems. I believe just that we haven't sometimes looked at them or promoted them in the right ways or not centrally enough.
Maybe we've lost moral imagination, the capacity to picture a nonviolent order. When you spend years studying how violence hides inside systems, what keeps you from cynicism? Where do you find hope and purpose?
So I tend to disagree with that, and I tend to disagree with what you just said on around the fact that we lost imaginative capacities. I believe that, on the contrary, if actors of violence are so are working so hard to control the stories, to control the narration, to control the narratives, to control the media that are shaping these narratives, or building the algorithm behind them, it's because they actually believe that they are reminiscence, at least, and very much and very powerful competitive imagination. And we didn't talk about this within like the neoliberalism, which is the current version of capitalism that we live in. Neoliberalism built a very optimistic story, and it's one of its strengths. It is a story that says that globalization is a force of nature, it is inevitable, that people do have a choice, that they do have a part in which, like, if they want to do it, then it will happen. So around which also, they have a better future that is in their reach. So they have been in the last decades a critical part of the imagination, but they always have been different stories coexisting again, due to the importance of religion, due to importance again of historical cultures and our social relations. So I don't think as well that these stories are monolithic, right? And so there are rooms for others. Many people understand the connection between those stories that have been told, to them, and some of the, challenges that they currently face, some of the inepties in the world around. There is a really strong understanding, and my work on disinformation, on its production, on its diffusion, and why people adhere to it has shown that very clearly. There is an appetite from all kinds of people and around this world for positive, well constructed, credible, human centered and human dignifying stories, for alternative, reading of this world and better projections. And where I believe that the so-called actors of progress, being political, economic, or others, are failing right now, is to propose something that is seen to be credible, but not that is also understandable in people's languages, that is also incarnated by people that look like, different parts of our societies, rather than, and that for me is the main issue. The main issue is not the appetite, is not the existence, is the method, is the way we have been telling some of those stories, and it's the language that we have used. It's the people that have been the main representative or self-proclaimed representatives of those better future. And so for me, that's the issue. It's not it's the human nature. It's not the appetite. It's not the existence of alternatives.
It's interesting. You mentioned Slobodian earlier, and now you're talking about neoliberalisms. In one of his books, he speaks about the beginning of the neoliberalism movement, and he calls it the Geneva School, made up mostly of Austrian economists who fled Austria, came to Switzerland, and then exported that to the United States, where the movement in the mid-70s gained traction and brought Reagan to power. And you can read it also that it's kind of that neoliberalistic movement and the politics that flowed out of it had a tremendous violent impact on the world in Latin America with the wars conducted by Bush. So I don't see neoliberalism as a very pacific movement.
Me neither. Absolutely. And I believe also it was built on a vision of the human being that had inherent classification, that you had a rightful elite driving the rest of the masses and legitimate to bypass a number of the common laws of the commons in the larger sense, being nature or violence or different regulations, nature protection, regulation of violent use, etc. Because it was, deemed, and it remains so, the most entitled and legitimate in order to rule the others. And this is really, when you read Hayek, or when you read some of the tech, some of the tech lords of this world right now, you must really look in Curtis Yarvin, for instance, which is what the promoter of what the so-called dark enlightenment. He's one of the main thinker influential around Peter Thiel, the boss of PayPal and Palantir. When you read their text, and I think it's important to do so, you see that it's a civilizational issue. It's a real vision of the human being that we are talking about. And this is what we are facing right now. And this is why I really call and I really hope that progressive actors around the world are going to wake up. And this is why also I'm spending time to with regard to build alternative or doing classes or spending time on podcasts, because I believe there is a wake up call that is absolutely necessary. There is a naivety that needs to stop immediately around what we are currently facing. What are we into? And what, again, Geneva, from the Geneva School until today, is rooted again in full 80 years of ideological path that really works into a strict hierarchy of the human being based on the ones that are useful, the ones that are born leaders, and the ones that are justifiably exploited. On stratification that is extremely rigid and I think highly problematic, and I don't, at least on myself, concur with.
There's Peter Turchin provides a very interesting lens through which he looks at the historical component of the cycles that seems to be coming back. So as the world faces climate disruption, digital dependency, and widening equality, how do you see the nature of violence evolving? What new forms are emerging, and what older ones are returning?
Yeah, I believe that we touched upon several. I believe, again, the new forms of digital exploitation, when it comes, for instance, to using digitalized violence as a commodity. I believe that psychologically and financially as well, in terms of the violences that it promotes is quite new. For instance, you have had people paying via cryptocurrencies very often to see other people harm themselves live. In China, it's been a very common practice through TikTok and through others, online platforms. In the dark web, you have had a number of new violent schemes involving, of course, sexual practices being commodified online, again, through new form of pornographies, new forms of violence, for instance, against handicapped people. You have had a case recently in France where those have been streamed live, and people accessing to these commodities would pay, would access to it via, again, a digital platform, would pay through via a cryptocurrency, and they have been, again, normalized and developed these kind of practices thanks to, again, a number of algorithms, a number of specific forums that very likely wouldn't exist if not the technological innovation upon which they rely on hadn't been invented. So that I would consider that to be quite new forms of violence, even if some of the practices described, all kinds of torture, of sexual exploitation, and other, already existed, in the past. And yeah, I believe that most of violent practices and form of economic exploitation are quite ancient and quite consistent as well. What really changes is the scale. It's the normalization. It's the centrality in, again, political projects and in their predominance within our economic systems and their predominance. And I believe, for instance, if you look at the level of inequalities within this world, that until the 70s, we were, on a path that was quite reductionary, or at least stable, and that since the 70s, and really in an exploding curve, they've been thriving at incredible pace. And so this is where you can visualize, I think, better than anywhere, where do certain ideas have effect. And for instance, you had a form of capitalism around and economies until the 70s and 80s that, for many reasons, was regulated, also because of social rights, because of the existence of other powerful actors within our economies, within our political systems. That politics, in a sense, was also a stronger regulator of the external deficiencies of the economic system. Was what we found is that the more the capitalistic system was predominant within, and the financial one within the political one, and taking control, through medias, through politics itself. And we see that businessmen right now are presidents around this world, right? We see that then the regulations tend to really be lowered, that the protection of the nature of the human beings, of the workers, of many others tend to considerably lower, and that the form of, again, nuance or the form of regulation, such as the regulation of inequalities, tend to be considerably affected and worsened.
We've covered a lot of ground today. It's been a very interesting conversation. Thank you for your time. I always end with this final question because conversations like ours inevitably leave many things unsaid. So, what is it we are not talking about, but we should be?
I believe that one of the key questions here that we haven't talked about, and that I am really curious as well to research more in coming years, is how do we collectively transform a collective demand, a collective aspiration, very clearly expressed, again, around this world, whatever the political systems in which we live, which is a call for more social economic justice, of less violence within our political, economic, and social systems, into political power, into institutional, I would say, capacity of regulation, right? For now, within the last 20 years, this translation has failed. And whenever the social revolution led to a coup or a dismantling of the current of the political structures, a few years later, the political regime in place were worse than the ones before, or equivalent at least, or didn't move an inch in their actual practice of power. And so that really profoundly interrogate me, is how do we actually, and as I told you, I believe we need to work on the method, right? Rather than the new conceptualization, we need to work on making the existent more visible. But we need also to think collectively in terms of methods of how do we regain power. And power is not a bad word. It's not an insult. Authority is not an insult. Authority is a contract of responsibility between people and an elected or a representative, that they chose. It is not, again, exploitation. It is not taking advantage of others at your own benefit, which is what the economies of violence really are. And so what I believe a lot of the progressists have been unable to do in recent decades is really reclaim the notion of power, of authority at the service of others. Reclaim the notion even of identity. And I believe that the real defense of our land or of the people is not a defense that is made against others at the expense of others. And so in that regard, this is for me one of the main questions that remains. I don't have the solution. I'll be delighted if I could share it with you now. But for me, this is really a key area that we collectively need to explore in the coming years.
Perhaps what we leave unspoken is also what connects us. The quiet ways violence persists and the quieter ways people resist.
True, absolutely, and it's why. And then again, I'm sorry. I come back to what we tried doing in Egregore. We believe that what connects people beyond concepts and words and incarnation is practical elements, is areas, is spaces, right, where we meet with one another. It can be a football stadium, but it can also be a local pub. It can be a school. It can be a sport team, a cultural club, etc., etc.
A podcast.
Thank you. And it's true. So we share something around which we can connect and discuss and share realities of this world. I believe that's why, sharing knowledge is so important, making it accessible, sharing it widely. And I believe that's also why, and that's why your work is so important, the one of Julien as well, through Sismic. And that's also why I believe that one of the key component here is linking people through shared reality, shared solutions, shared enhancement of their lives. And this is what we really try, with all of our efforts and energy to do at Egregor. We work alongside some of the best social, environmental, civic innovators in Africa and Europe, and we provide them with all of the support we can, financially, technical, strategic, to enhance their visibility, to enhance their resilience, their capacity to be more accessible for others. And so if there are some people of your audience that would like to contact us, to me, to join this collective effort, it's really a collaborative, non-endogamic, effort gathering dozens of people worldwide. They are more than welcome to do so.
Thank you, Guillaume, for your time. And I suspect that our path will cross. I have many areas of interest that are similar to yours.
Thank you so much again for having me, Gabor.